By the 1850s, the American population had grown to a whopping 23 million. This included 3.6 million African Americans. About 500,000 African Americans were free, but the majority were still slaves. Many of the free slaves were those former slaves who had escaped to obtain their freedom. Regardless of if slaves were free or not, racism shaped their lives. White people everywhere looked down on black people. Whites ignored the great contributions that blacks made because white people thought of this as their country. This prompted African Americans to stand up. One African American scholar by the name of W.E.B. Du Bois asked,
"Your country? How came it to be yours? Before the Pilgrims landed, we were here. Here we brought you our three gifts and mingled them with yours. A gift of story and song, soft, stirring melody in an unmelodious land. The gift of sweat and brawn to beat back the wilderness and lay the foundations of this vast economic empire. The third, a gift of the spirit."
There was the North and the South. There were the free slaves and the not-so-free. Depending on where the African Americans lived, their life would be decided for them. Frederick Douglass, for example, toured the North and talked with white audiences about slavery and how slaves and free African Americans had different legal status. Free blacks had some rights by law, whereas slaves did not. He reminded his audiences that the law defined slaves not as humans, but as property. Slaves could be bought or sold, traded or given to anyone, even to settle a bet. But in many states, slaves could be free. Being property was hard because they didn't enjoy the same rights that many free people took for granted. Frederick Douglass summed it up by saying, "The slaves have no wife, no children, no country, no home. He can own nothing, possesses nothing, and acquire nothing." There were two types of slaves. One type worked on farms and plantations in the South. By the 1860s, there were also urban slaves. These slaves were hired to work in factories, mills, or workshops, but they didn't even get to keep the money that they earned. It belonged to their owners. They were more free because they were not under the watchful eye of their owner all day. But still, that just ain't right. I mean, imagine you work all day, earn a fat paycheck, only to hand it over to someone else. About half of all the free African Americans lived in the South. They worked as laborers, craftspeople, or household servants in towns or cities. They were viewed as a dangerous group that must be controlled. They were forbidden from doing many things, such as owning a gun, traveling freely from town to town or state to state, or even to work certain jobs. This led Frederick Douglass to the conclusion that no colored man is really free in a slave-holding state. In the North, African Americans lived freer lives than in the South, but they, too, experienced discrimination and segregation. In many states, they were denied rights such as the right to vote, and everywhere they had trouble finding work. In the 1850s, about 87% of free African Americans in New York held low-paying jobs. Not only were they denied rights, but they were often separated from white people in nearly all public places, such as schools. Even Frederick Douglass felt this racism when he tried to join a church in New Bedford, Massachusetts, only to be denied. African Americans began to respond to this discrimination by taking things into their own hands, like Richard Allen, a former slave who became the first bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church and created the African Society for the Education of the Youth. Other Northerners started their own schools, churches, and self-help organizations. In 1853, the National Council of Colored People was established to help protest the unequal treatment they received.
There was one matter in particular that made white farmers of the South want to have slavery stick around, and that was money. After the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, the Southern economy began to improve. This was mainly due to the fact that cotton was so profitable. Southern farmers' economy depended on cotton and slave labor to make it profitable. This caused a rise in demand in slaves, which in turn made the slaves more valuable. Farmers are taking better care of their slaves because of this. We will be learning all about working and living conditions, as well as the lives of slaves when you return to class next. How exciting!
There was that ant that stood up to me.
Yeah, but we can forget about him.
Yeah, it was just one ant. One ant.
Yeah, you're right. It's just one ant.
Yeah, boss, they're puny.
Puny? Say, let's pretend this grain is a puny little ant. Did that hurt?
Nope.
Well, how about this one?
Are you kidding?
Well, how about this?
You let one ant stand up to us, then they all might stand up.
Those puny little ants outnumber us 100 to 1. And if they ever figure that out, there goes our way of life.
It's not about food. It's about keeping those ants in line. That's why we're going back.
Does anybody else want to stay?